Pick it up, Maid. The words cracked across the marble lobby like a whip. A ring of executives fell silent as a set of silver keys skidded across the polished floor and stopped inches from Maya Williams's shoes. The chandelier above scattered warm gold light across the marble, but the air suddenly felt cold. Maya looked down at the keys, then up at Richard Sterling. The billionaire stood with one hand in his pocket, a faint smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. Around him, expensive suits shifted and smirked. Someone chuckled. Someone else looked away. Maya slowly bent down, picked up the keys, and placed them into Richard's outstretched hand. Her expression never changed. "Thank you," she said quietly. Richard laughed. "See? That was not difficult." More laughter followed. The sound echoed against the 40-foot ceilings of Sterling Plaza. Maya nodded once and turned away. Her cleaning cart squeaked softly as she pushed it across the lobby. Behind her, the billionaire was already entertaining investors, shaking hands, talking numbers, talking power. To them, she was invisible again. Just another black maid in a Navy maintenance uniform. Just another employee polishing a building she could never afford to enter as a guest. At least that was what they thought. Maya stopped near a wall of glass overlooking downtown Chicago. Beyond it, sunlight bounced off steel towers and moving traffic far below. Her reflection stared back at her. Calm. Controlled. Unbothered. But inside her pocket, her fingers brushed against a small silver key. Not Richard's key. Her key. Old. Scratched. Important. Her grandfather had carried it for 20 years. A sudden burst of noise snapped her attention back toward the lobby entrance. 3 black SUVs rolled to a stop outside. Men in tailored suits stepped out quickly. Their faces looked tense. Too tense. Richard noticed it too. His smile faded. One of his attorneys hurried across the marble floor. Fast. Almost running. Not good. Richard's eyes narrowed. "What is it?" he asked. The attorney leaned close and whispered something into his ear. For the first time all morning, the billionaire's confidence flickered. Just for a second. Maya saw it. Everyone saw it. "That is impossible," Richard said sharply. "Check again." The attorney swallowed. "We already did." The laughter in the room disappeared. Investors exchanged nervous glances. Phones came out. Voices lowered. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Richard turned toward the elevators. "Boardroom. Now." The group moved immediately. Expensive shoes clicked across marble. Elevator doors opened. Closed. Silence returned. Maya watched them disappear. Then she resumed cleaning. 10 minutes later, alarms were not sounding, but the building somehow felt louder. Staff whispered near reception. Security guards checked their radios twice. On the 42nd floor, a billion-dollar acquisition was suddenly hanging by a thread. Nobody knew why. Or rather, almost nobody. Maya pushed her cart into a quiet service corridor. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The smell of fresh paint lingered in the air. She opened a small maintenance closet and stepped inside. For a moment, she was completely alone. Her hand reached into her pocket. Slowly, she removed the silver key. Then she opened an old metal lockbox hidden behind cleaning supplies. Inside sat a stack of documents. Property records. Ownership certificates. Legal agreements. Her eyes rested on one page in particular. 50% ownership. Sterling Plaza Holdings. Maya exhaled slowly. Footsteps thundered down the hallway outside. Fast. Urgent. A voice shouted her name. "Maya!" The closet door swung open. A young legal assistant stood there, pale and breathless. "They are looking for you." Maya carefully closed the lockbox. "Who is?" The assistant stared at her like she had just asked whether the sky was blue. Then he said 5 words that made the entire building feel different. "The board knows who you are." Maya did not move. The maintenance closet suddenly felt smaller, the hum of the fluorescent light louder. The young legal assistant stood in the doorway, breathing hard. "The board knows who you are," he repeated. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Maya quietly slid the ownership documents back into the lockbox and turned the key. Her hands were steady. The assistants were not. "They are waiting upstairs." Maya closed the metal lid with a soft click. "Then they can keep waiting another minute." The assistant blinked. Nobody spoke about Richard Sterling that way. Nobody. Especially not a maid. Upstairs, tension was spreading through the boardroom like smoke. The 42nd floor overlooked the entire city, but nobody was admiring the view anymore. Phones buzzed. Lawyers whispered. Investors shifted nervously in leather chairs worth more than most people's monthly rent. Richard Sterling stood at the head of the table, jaw tight. "Find her." His voice was low. "Dangerous." "We already did," one attorney replied. "Then bring her here." A silence followed. The attorney exchanged an uncomfortable glance with another board member. She refused. The room froze. Richard stared at him. "She what?" Down in the service corridor, Maya stepped out of the closet and continued pushing her cleaning cart. The wheels rattled softly over concrete flooring. The smell of machine oil drifted from the maintenance garage below. Her navy uniform looked exactly the same as it had an hour ago. Nothing about her appearance suggested that half the building legally belonged to her. Yet word was spreading. Employees stopped talking when she walked past. Security guards suddenly stood straighter. Even managers who had ignored her for years now avoided eye contact. Maya noticed all of it. She hated all of it. Not because people suddenly respected her. Because they only respected her now. Her phone vibrated. One message appeared on the screen. Unknown number. "Please come to the boardroom immediately." She deleted it. The elevator doors opened ahead of her. Two senior executives stepped out. Both white. Both wearing tailored suits. Both had laughed when Richard threw the keys earlier. Now they looked nervous. "Ms. Williams," one of them said carefully. Maya stopped. Neither man seemed sure how close to stand. "Yes?" The older executive forced a smile. "There appears to have been a misunderstanding." Maya's eyes remained calm. "A misunderstanding?" The man swallowed. "About your position." Position. Not ownership. Not shareholder. Position. Maya almost smiled. Almost. "I see." The executive stepped aside as though clearing a path for royalty. Maya pushed her cart directly between them and continued walking. Behind her, neither man spoke. Back upstairs, Richard's frustration was turning into something else. Something colder. The lead attorney slid a thick folder across the conference table. Richard opened it. His eyes scanned the pages. Property transfers. Trust agreements. Historical ownership records. Every page led back to the same name. Maya Williams. The billionaire's fingers tightened around the folder. "This cannot be right." "It is." "A maid owns half my building?" The attorney hesitated. "Technically, Mr. Sterling." Richard looked up sharply. "What?" The attorney cleared his throat. "It is not your building." The room fell silent. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Richard slowly lowered the folder. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, dark clouds were gathering over Chicago. The sunlight that had filled the room an hour ago was gone. "Explain." The attorney opened another file. Older. Thicker. Dust-colored pages scanned from decades-old records. The original rescue investment that saved Sterling Plaza during the recession. Richard's face hardened. "What about it?" The attorney looked directly at him. "You were told your father secured those funds alone." A long pause followed. Then the attorney delivered the sentence that changed everything. "That was not true." Richard's expression shifted for the first time all day. Confusion. Real confusion. The attorney opened the final page. A faded photograph slid onto the table. Richard looked down. His eyes widened. Because standing beside his father in the picture was a man he recognized immediately. A man whose face he had seen somewhere before. Somewhere very recently. Then his stomach dropped. The man in the photograph was Maya Williams's father. Richard Sterling stared at the photograph as if it might change if he looked long enough. It did not. The grainy image showed his father shaking hands with Marcus Williams beside a half-finished steel frame that would one day become Sterling Plaza. Dust coated their boots. Both men were smiling. Both looked like owners. The billionaire's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. That is impossible. His voice sounded smaller now. The attorney slid another document forward. Your father never owned the majority stake. The room went silent. Outside the windows, thunder rolled somewhere over the city. Several investors exchanged uneasy glances. A phone camera quietly switched on beneath the table. Richard noticed. Put that away. Nobody moved. For the first time in years, he was no longer the most powerful person in the room. Down on the service level, Maya stepped into the freight elevator. The old machinery groaned as the doors closed. Fluorescent light reflected off the metal walls. Her reflection stared back at her from 4 directions. Calm. Composed. The elevator climbed slowly. Her phone vibrated again. Another message. This time from the chairman of the board. Please come immediately. We need to discuss ownership. Maya looked at the screen for a moment. Then slipped the phone back into her pocket. Ownership. Funny how nobody had used that word this morning. Upstairs, pressure was building. Richard flipped through page after page. Every document led to the same conclusion. His father had not built the empire alone. Marcus Williams had funded the project when banks refused. Marcus Williams had guaranteed the loans. Marcus Williams had saved the building. Yet Richard had never heard his name. Not once. Why? He demanded. Why was this hidden? Nobody answered immediately. Then the oldest board member slowly removed his glasses. His hands trembled slightly. Because your father asked us to. Richard turned toward him. What are you talking about? The old man's eyes dropped to the photograph. The city was different 30 years ago. Nobody needed him to explain further. The room understood. The silence became heavier. Richard's jaw tightened. A memory surfaced. His father standing in front of the building during a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Cameras flashing. Reporters cheering. One detail suddenly felt wrong. There had been an empty space beside him. A space that now made sense. The boardroom doors opened. Every head turned. Maya stepped inside wearing the same maintenance uniform. The room instantly froze. Several people stood. Others lowered their eyes. Richard remained seated. His face unreadable. Maya quietly pushed her cleaning cart against the wall and folded her hands in front of her. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Even the air conditioning seemed louder. Finally, Richard broke the silence. You knew. Maya looked at him. About what? Everything. Her gaze never moved. No. Richard stood. Do not lie to me. The room tensed. Maya remained calm. I learned the truth 3 years ago after my grandfather passed away. That answer hit harder than anyone expected. Richard blinked. 3 years? Maya nodded. 3 years. And you stayed here cleaning floors? A few executives shifted uncomfortably. Maya's eyes moved across the room. Across the expensive watches. The polished shoes. The people who never learned her name. Someone had to take care of the building. The words landed harder than any accusation. Nobody spoke. Nobody could. Then another attorney hurried into the room carrying a sealed envelope. His face was pale. Very pale. We found this in the archive vault. He placed it on the table. It was addressed to both families. Richard frowned. What is it? The attorney swallowed. A letter from your father. The room fell silent again. Maya's expression changed for the first time all day. Barely. But enough. Because she recognized the handwriting immediately. The attorney slowly broke the seal. Then his eyes widened. "Oh my God!" Richard stepped forward. "What does it say?" The attorney looked up, stunned. Then he turned toward Maya. "According to this letter, your father was never supposed to lose his ownership." The attorney's words seemed to drain the oxygen from the room. "According to this letter, your father was never supposed to lose his ownership." Nobody moved. The soft hum of the air vents suddenly sounded deafening. Outside the glass walls, lightning flickered across the darkening Chicago skyline. Richard Sterling stared at the envelope. His pulse hammered visibly in his neck. "Read it," he demanded. The attorney swallowed and unfolded the yellowed pages. The paper crackled in the silence. Several investors leaned forward. A phone camera quietly began recording again. Nobody stopped it this time. "If anything happens to me," the attorney read, "Marcus Williams and his family are to retain their full ownership rights. Any transfer made without their written consent is invalid." A murmur spread through the room. Then another line. "The building belongs to both families. It always will." Richard's face went pale. Across the room, Maya stood perfectly still. Her maintenance uniform suddenly looked more powerful than every tailored suit in the building. The chairman slowly lowered his head. "We never saw this letter." Maya's eyes narrowed slightly. "Someone did." The room fell silent again. She was right. Someone had known. Someone had buried it. Richard turned sharply toward the board. "Who authorized the ownership transfer?" No one answered. The silence itself became an answer. The billionaire slammed his palm against the conference table. Several people jumped. "Who did it?" A senior director finally spoke. His voice shook. "Your father died unexpectedly. The paperwork moved quickly. Nobody questioned it." Maya looked directly at him. "That is not what happened." Every eye turned toward her. The director frowned. "Excuse me?" Maya stepped forward. The polished floor reflected the cold light above her. "The transfer documents were filed 6 months before Richard's father died." The room froze. Richard stared at her. "How do you know that?" Maya did not answer immediately. Instead, she opened her cleaning cart. Executives exchanged confused looks. Inside were spray bottles, towels, maintenance supplies, and a thin black binder. She placed it on the table. Slowly. Deliberately. The sound echoed through the room. Richard's attorney opened it. His eyes widened immediately. "Where did you get these?" Maya's voice remained calm. "From the building archives." The attorney rapidly flipped pages. Legal filings. Dates. Signatures. Banking records. Every document pointed toward the same terrifying conclusion. The ownership transfer had been planned long before anyone claimed it was necessary. A ripple of panic moved through the boardroom. One investor quietly stood and backed away from the table. Another started texting furiously. The chairman's hands trembled. "This cannot be happening." Maya looked at him. "It already happened." Richard felt the ground shifting beneath him. For years he believed he had inherited an empire. Now every document seemed to suggest the empire had been built on something rotten. Something hidden. Something his father may never have intended. "Who benefited?" Richard asked quietly. Nobody answered. Then Maya looked toward the far end of the table. Not at Richard. Not at the chairman. At someone else. A man who had remained silent all afternoon. Harold Bennett. The board's longest-serving financial officer. 70 years old. Impeccable reputation. Trusted by everyone. Harold suddenly stopped breathing normally. Maya noticed. So did Richard. "Mr. Bennett?" Richard asked. Harold forced a smile. "This is ridiculous." Maya never looked away from him. "Then why are you sweating?" The old man's hand tightened around his water glass. Tiny tremors shook his fingers. The room grew deathly quiet. Outside, thunder rolled again. Harold stood abruptly. I am leaving. Nobody moved. Nobody stopped him. Then Maya spoke one sentence. Soft. Precise. Deadly. You visited my grandfather 3 days before he died. Harold froze. Complete silence crashed over the room. Richard slowly turned toward the man he had trusted for most of his life. The old executive's face had lost all color. Maya reached into the black binder and removed a single photograph. Then she slid it across the table. Richard looked down. His stomach dropped instantly. Because the photograph showed Harold Bennett standing beside Maya's grandfather, holding the very same ownership documents everyone thought had been lost forever. The photograph slid across the polished table and stopped directly in front of Richard Sterling. Nobody spoke. Nobody breathed. The only sound came from the soft hum of the building's ventilation system and the distant rumble of thunder outside. Richard stared at the image. Harold Bennett. Maya's grandfather. The ownership documents. All in the same frame. The billionaire slowly looked up. Harold had not moved. The old executive stood frozen beneath the cold white lights, his face drained of color. For decades he had controlled every financial record that passed through Sterling Plaza. Now dozens of eyes were locked on him. Investor eyes. Lawyer eyes. Camera lenses. Waiting. Watching. Judging. Explain this, Richard said. His voice was low. Dangerous. Harold swallowed. His collar suddenly looked too tight. It is not what you think. Maya's expression never changed. Then tell them what it is. The room tightened. Harold looked at her. Really looked at her. For the first time all day, the old executive seemed afraid. You do not understand what your grandfather was involved in. A murmur spread across the boardroom. Maya felt every eye shift toward her. There it was. The pressure. The suspicion. The familiar feeling of becoming the target. Harold stepped forward. Your grandfather made choices. Several investors exchanged glances. One attorney frowned. Richard watched silently. Harold's voice grew stronger. Desperate people often became louder. He signed agreements. He accepted compensation. He knew exactly what was happening. Suddenly the room changed. Investors who had begun sympathizing with Maya now looked uncertain. Doubt spread quickly. Faster than truth. Maya could feel it. Harold saw it too. That was why he kept talking. You came here pretending to be a victim. He pointed toward the ownership records. But your family benefited from all of this. The accusation landed hard. Several phones lowered. Several eyes narrowed. Richard stared at Maya. Waiting. Testing. The room had turned into a courtroom without anyone announcing it. Maya stood completely alone. Again. Exactly where people always wanted her. Then the emergency alarm chirped once. Just once. A brief electronic pulse from somewhere deep inside the building. Everyone looked up. The sound vanished immediately. But Maya noticed something nobody else did. Her eyes shifted toward the maintenance status screen mounted beside the conference room doors. A tiny red warning light was blinking. Once every 3 seconds. Blink. Pause. Blink. Pause. Her stomach tightened. Harold continued speaking. Richard continued listening. Nobody noticed the warning except her. Maya stepped toward the screen. The chairman frowned. What are you doing? Maya ignored him. The red indicator flashed again. Mechanical systems. Lower utility levels. Restricted access. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Maya? Richard's voice cut through the room. She turned toward him. How long has that warning been active? Several executives looked confused. Richard glanced at the screen. What warning? Maya pointed. That one. The room fell silent. The maintenance director immediately checked his tablet. His expression changed instantly. That is impossible. Maya's eyes narrowed. What is? The man swallowed. Hard. The archive vault. Suddenly every lawyer in the room stood. What about it? The maintenance director stared at the incoming diagnostics. His hands trembled. Someone accessed it 20 minutes ago. The boardroom erupted. Voices overlapped. Phones came out. Questions flew in every direction. Harold's face turned ghost white. Maya saw it immediately. So did Richard. Who accessed it? Richard demanded. The director checked again. Then looked up slowly. The security logs were erased. Complete silence crashed over the room. Maya felt the pieces locking together. The hidden documents. The missing records. The ownership transfer. The letter. Harold. None of this was over. Not even close. Then the maintenance director received another alert. His eyes widened. He stared at the screen as if he could not believe what he was reading. Richard stepped forward. What now? The man's voice barely came out above a whisper. Someone just opened a safety deposit box inside the archive vault. Nobody moved. Nobody blinked. Richard felt cold. Maya felt colder. Because there was only one box stored in that vault under special protection for the last 30 years. The box registered under Marcus Williams's name. Then a new message appeared on the screen. Content removed. Timestamp, 12 minutes ago. The words content removed seemed to linger in the air long after the screen stopped flashing. Nobody spoke. The panic that had filled the room moments ago was gone. In its place sat something heavier. Fear. Real fear. The maintenance director lowered his tablet slowly. The faint hum of electronics echoed through the boardroom. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the glass walls. Richard Sterling stared at the screen without blinking. 12 minutes ago. While everyone had been arguing. While everyone had been watching Maya. Someone had been taking the most important evidence in the building. The realization hit him like cold water. He looked around the room. For the first time all day, he no longer knew who he could trust. The investors seemed smaller now. The executives quieter. Even Harold Bennett had stopped talking. The old man sat motionless, staring at the tabletop. Maya remained standing near the end of the conference room. Calm. Too calm. The same woman who had been polishing floors that morning now seemed to be the only person whose pulse was not racing. A phone vibrated softly somewhere in the room. Nobody reached for it. Richard finally turned toward her. You knew. His voice came out rough. Maya looked at him. About the vault? Richard nodded. Maya's eyes shifted toward the rain sliding down the glass. No. The answer surprised him. She could have taken advantage of the moment. She could have pretended to know everything. Instead, she simply told the truth. The room noticed. Richard noticed. The silence deepened. A maintenance alarm chirped faintly somewhere below the building, then disappeared. Maya's gaze moved toward the city beyond the windows. Thousands of lights glowed through the storm. For a moment she seemed far away. Then she quietly spoke. My grandfather always said people hide things in plain sight. Several heads lifted. Nobody interrupted. Maya stepped toward the conference table. The cold overhead lights reflected across the polished surface. Everyone is looking at the vault. Her finger lightly tapped the blinking security report. Which means whoever removed the contents wanted everyone looking there. The room froze. Richard felt something shift inside his chest. She was right. Again. The chairman frowned. You think the vault was a distraction? Maya looked directly at him. I think someone needed time. The words settled heavily across the room. Investors exchanged uneasy glances. Several executives suddenly looked toward the doors. Toward their phones. Toward each other. Suspicion was spreading again. But differently now. Maya was no longer standing outside the conversation. She was standing at the center of it. Richard slowly sat down. The leather chair creaked beneath him. For the first time in years, he listened instead of speaking. Across the room, Harold Bennett watched Maya carefully. Too carefully. she noticed. His eyes carried something new now. Not confidence. Not arrogance. Worry. Real worry. Maya remembered something. A detail so small she had almost forgotten it. 3 nights earlier. Late shift. Empty hallway. Harold leaving the archive wing after midnight. At the time it had seemed strange. Now it felt important. Very important. Richard noticed her expression change. What is it? Maya hesitated. The room leaned forward. She reached into her maintenance cart. Slowly. Deliberately. Every eye followed her hand. She removed a worn employee notebook. Nothing special. Nothing dramatic. Just a small notebook with grease stains along the edges. Richard frowned. What is that? Maya opened it. Pages filled with dates. Notes. Maintenance requests. Observations. Things nobody else bothered recording. She flipped through the pages until she found one entry. Then she placed the notebook on the table. Richard looked down. His stomach tightened. The entry was dated 3 nights ago. Underneath it was a simple sentence written in Maya's neat handwriting. Harold Bennett entered archive level B at 11:42 p.m. Left carrying a black document case. The room fell silent again. Even Harold stopped breathing normally. Then something happened that nobody expected. The old executive closed his eyes. Just for a second. Not denial. Not anger. Resignation. Maya saw it immediately. Richard saw it too. And in that tiny moment, both of them realized the same terrifying thing. Harold Bennett was no longer protecting himself. He was protecting someone else. Then the boardroom doors opened. Every head turned. A soaked security officer stood in the doorway, rainwater dripping from his jacket. His face was pale. Mr. Sterling, he said quietly. We found the vehicle that left the underground garage 12 minutes ago. Nobody moved. The officer swallowed hard. You need to see who was driving it. The room did not breathe. The security officer stood frozen in the doorway, rainwater dripping onto the polished floor. Every eye locked onto him. Every phone camera remained raised. Richard Sterling felt his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Who was driving? He asked. The officer swallowed. His face looked almost as shocked as everyone else's. Then he turned his tablet around. The security footage filled the screen. Grainy. Dark. Recorded from the underground garage 12 minutes earlier. A black sedan rolled slowly toward the exit gate. The driver's face came into view for less than 2 seconds. Then the room erupted. That is impossible. The words came from 3 different people at once. Richard stared at the screen. Harold Bennett was not behind the wheel. The chairman was not behind the wheel. None of the executives were. The driver was a woman. Gray hair. Elegant coat. Calm expression. Richard's stomach dropped. My mother. Complete silence crashed over the room. The billionaire took a step backward. Then another. For years Eleanor Sterling had stayed away from board meetings. Away from negotiations. Away from public business. Yet somehow she was connected to the missing archive contents. The room suddenly felt smaller. Hotter. More dangerous. Investors exchanged stunned looks. Several executives lowered their heads. Nobody knew what to say. Maya did. She stepped closer to the screen. The cold light reflected softly across her face. Calm. Focused. Certain. Pause it! The officer obeyed. The image froze. Richard looked at her. Why? Maya pointed toward the passenger seat. At first nobody saw it. Then one attorney leaned closer. His eyes widened. Wait! More people stepped forward. The room crowded around the screen. There, reflected faintly in the passenger side window, sat a black document case. The same type Harold Bennett had been carrying. The same type seen in the old photograph. The same type connected to the missing records. Richard felt the last pieces beginning to move. Not together. Apart. Everything he believed about his family was falling apart. Maya studied the reflection for another moment. Then she quietly spoke. She did not take the documents to destroy them. The room turned toward her. Richard frowned. How can you know that? Maya pointed again. Because she brought the case with her before entering the building. Silence. The realization spread slowly. Then all at once. If Eleanor Sterling arrived carrying the case, the documents had already been removed before she entered the archive level. Somebody else had taken them first. The entire room shifted again. Another reversal. Another assumption shattered. Harold Bennett closed his eyes. Richard saw it immediately. You knew. Harold said nothing. Richard stepped forward. You knew she was protecting someone. The old executive looked exhausted now. Not frightened. Not cornered. Just tired. 30 years of secrets seemed to weigh on his shoulders. Finally, he spoke. Your mother tried to stop it. The room froze. Richard felt his chest tighten. Stop what? Harold looked toward Maya. Then toward the rain-covered skyline beyond the glass. The theft. Nobody moved. Even the cameras seemed still. Maya watched him carefully. This was the first time all day he had answered a question directly. Which meant something had changed. Harold's voice cracked slightly. Your father discovered the truth before he died. Richard stared at him. What truth? Harold hesitated. The silence stretched. Then came the sentence nobody expected. Marcus Williams did not save the building alone. Maya's expression changed for the first time in hours. Barely. But enough. Richard noticed. Everyone noticed. Harold slowly pointed toward the photograph still lying on the conference table. Toward Marcus Williams. Toward Richard's father. Then toward someone nobody had been talking about. Someone nobody had considered. Eleanor Sterling. There were 3 owners. Complete silence. Maya felt her pulse quicken. Richard looked as though the ground beneath him had disappeared. 3 owners. 3 signatures. 3 families. Which meant one thing. Somewhere out there existed a third share. A third claim. A third secret owner nobody had ever identified. Then Richard's phone vibrated. Once. Loud in the silence. He looked down. The color drained from his face instantly. It was a text message from his mother. Only 6 words. I found what they hid. Run. Richard Sterling stared at the message on his phone as if the words themselves were impossible. I found what they hid. Run. The glow of the screen reflected in his eyes. Around him, nobody spoke. The storm outside had softened into steady rain. Water slid down the massive windows in silver ribbons, blurring the city lights beyond. For the first time all day, the boardroom was completely still. Not because people were confused. Because they were beginning to understand. Slowly, Richard lowered the phone. His hand trembled. Across the room, dozens of eyes drifted toward Maya. Not with suspicion anymore. Not with amusement. Not with dismissal. Something else. Respect. The change was subtle, but impossible to miss. Earlier that morning she had been the woman pushing a cleaning cart through the lobby. The woman told to pick up a billionaire's keys. The woman nobody bothered learning the name of. Now the same executives who once talked over her sat silent, waiting for her to speak. Maya felt it. The shift. The weight of attention. Yet her posture never changed. Her voice never rose. Her expression never hardened into victory. She simply stood there. Calm. Grounded. Unmoved. The chairman slowly removed his glasses. His eyes looked older now. We were wrong! The words hung in the room. Several investors lowered their heads. Others stared at the table. Nobody argued. Nobody defended themselves. The truth had become too large. Richard looked toward Maya. For a moment, he struggled to find words. Not legal words. Not business words. Human words. The cold light overhead reflected across the polished conference table between them, a distance that suddenly felt much larger than a few feet. This morning. His voice faltered. Cameras continued recording. Nobody interrupted. Richard swallowed. I never asked your name. Silence followed. Maya looked at him. Her eyes were steady. No, she said softly. You did not. The sentence landed harder than any accusation. Richard looked away first. The billionaire who had controlled every room he entered for 20 years could not hold her gaze. Around the table, several executives shifted uncomfortably. They remembered the lobby. The keys. The laughter. The assumptions. One investor quietly turned off his phone camera. Another lowered his eyes. The humiliation had not disappeared. It had simply changed direction. Maya noticed none of them trying to justify what happened. That mattered. More than apologies. More than explanations. Then Harold Bennett slowly stood from his chair. Every eye followed him. The old executive looked exhausted. Smaller somehow. Like the secrets had been holding him upright all these years. He looked toward Maya. Your grandfather trusted me. His voice cracked. Maya remained silent. Harold nodded once. I did not deserve it. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The confession echoed through the room like a final piece falling into place. Harold turned toward Richard. Your father spent years trying to correct what happened. Richard's eyes widened slightly. What? Harold looked toward the rain-covered windows. He failed. A painful silence followed. The realization hit Richard harder than any document. Harder than any ownership dispute. His father had known. His mother had known. Maya's family had carried the consequences. And somehow the people least responsible had suffered the most. Richard looked back toward Maya. Not as a maid. Not as an opponent. Not as a shareholder. As a person. The room felt different now. Softer. Sadder. Honest. Then the elevator chimes sounded from the hallway outside. One quiet tone. Everyone turned. The boardroom doors remained closed. Nobody entered. Yet Maya's attention sharpened immediately. She recognized that sound. The private executive elevator. Rarely used. Almost never. Richard's phone vibrated again. This time there was no message. Only a live location pin. Shared by Eleanor Sterling. The dot was moving. Not away from the building. Toward it. The room held its breath. Maya stared at the screen. Richard stared at the screen. The location stopped exactly one floor below them. Then the elevator indicator outside lit up. 41, a pause. Then 42. The doors had not opened yet. But everyone in the room knew the person carrying the final piece of the truth was arriving. The elevator doors opened with a soft metallic whisper. Nobody in the boardroom moved. Nobody needed to. The room had been running on tension for hours, and now it had finally run out of places to hide. Eleanor Sterling stepped out carrying the black document case in one hand. Rainwater glistened on her coat. Her silver hair caught the cold overhead light. She looked tired. Not frightened. Not defeated. Just tired. The kind of tired that comes from carrying the same secret for 30 years. The room remained silent as she entered. Even the phone cameras lowered slightly. Something about the moment felt too personal to record. Richard stared at his mother. What did you find? Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Then she placed the case on the conference table. The click of the latches echoed through the room. Inside sat dozens of documents. Original ownership records. Letters. Contracts. Photographs. History. The kind of history people spend decades trying to bury. Eleanor gently removed one faded photograph and slid it toward Maya. Maya looked down. Her breath caught. It showed 3 people standing together beside the unfinished steel skeleton of the building. Marcus Williams. Richard's father. Eleanor Sterling. All smiling. All equal. Nobody standing behind anyone else. Nobody hidden from the camera. Richard slowly lowered himself into his chair. The realization settled over him like a weight. Not because he had lost power. Because he finally understood where it came from. Eleanor's voice was quiet. Your grandfather and Maya's grandfather built this place together. She paused. I spent years trying to protect that truth. No one interrupted. The rain continued tapping softly against the windows. Harold Bennett lowered his eyes. The chairman sat motionless. Investors who had once viewed the day as a business dispute now looked like witnesses to something much deeper. Maya stared at the photograph. Her fingers brushed lightly across the image of her grandfather. For a moment, the noise of the city beyond the glass disappeared. The boardroom disappeared. Everything disappeared except that picture. Richard stood slowly. His expensive suit suddenly looked meaningless. The billionaire who had entered the lobby that morning believing he owned everything now felt smaller than he ever had. He walked around the table. No cameras clicked. No one spoke. The room watched. He stopped in front of Maya. She met his eyes. The same eyes he had barely looked at earlier when he tossed his keys across the floor. Richard swallowed. I was wrong. The words came quietly. No speeches. No excuses. No attempt to defend himself. Just the truth. Maya said nothing. Richard looked down briefly before forcing himself to continue. About you. Another pause. About all of it. The silence that followed felt honest. Maya could see the embarrassment in his face. The regret. The realization. Not the kind people perform when they get caught. The kind that changes them. Slowly, Maya nodded once. Nothing more. She did not humiliate him. She did not remind him what happened in the lobby. She did not ask for revenge. That surprised everyone most of all. The power in the room shifted completely in that moment. Not because she owned half the building. Not because she had won. Because she no longer needed to prove anything. Outside, the storm was beginning to pass. A faint glow of evening sunlight broke through the clouds and spilled across the glass walls. Golden reflections stretched across the conference table. Across the ownership records. Across the photograph. Richard noticed something on the table beside Maya's hand. His silver keys. Someone must have brought them up from the lobby. For a moment he stared at them. Then, without a word, he picked them up and gently placed them in Maya's hand. Not as an order. Not as a test. As respect. The room watched the small gesture. Nobody missed its meaning. Maya looked at the keys for a second. Then quietly set them back on the table between them. Neither of them needed them anymore. The cameras lowered completely. The investors looked away. The tension that had consumed the building all day finally loosened its grip. As people slowly began leaving the boardroom, Maya remained near the window. The city lights flickered on below. Behind her, conversations resumed in soft voices. Papers shuffled. Chairs moved. Life continued. Yet something fundamental had changed. Richard paused at the doorway before leaving. He looked back one last time. Maya stood in the fading sunlight, her maintenance uniform glowing softly against the glass, holding the photograph of her grandfather. Not a maid. Not an owner. Just a woman who had carried dignity longer than anyone else had carried power. And as the last light of the day settled across the room, the building seemed to remember exactly who had helped build it.